The forest is a place of primal beauty and profound silence. For generations, hunters have ventured into its depths, seeking a connection to something ancient, a test of skill and patience. They learn the patterns of the wild, the rustle of leaves that signals a deer, the call of a bird that means all is well. But sometimes, the silence is broken by a sound that doesn't belong. Sometimes, the patterns are wrong. The hunter, who believes they are at the top of the food chain, discovers that they are not the only thing stalking through the undergrowth. They find themselves in a place where the rules of nature are twisted, and the line between predator and prey becomes terrifyingly blurred. Tonight, we have 5 scary true stories from hunters deep in the wilderness. These are tales from people who went into the woods looking for a trophy, and came back with a story that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Story 1. The Wrong Call. Our first story comes from a man named Dale, a deer hunter with over 20 years of experience in the dense forests of northern Minnesota. Dale wasn't the kind of guy to get spooked easily. He knew the woods like the back of his hand. He knew the sounds, the smells, and the subtle signs that most people would walk right past. He prided himself on his calm demeanor and his deep respect for the wild. That all changed during a solo hunting trip one cold November. He'd set up his tree stand before dawn, in a spot he knew was a major deer highway. The air was crisp, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle rustling of wind through the skeletal branches of the birch trees. 4 hours, he sat, perfectly still, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Nothing. The woods were unusually quiet that morning. Just as he was starting to think about packing it in for lunch, he heard it. It was the unmistakable sound of a doe bleat, a soft, inviting call. But something was off. It was a little too guttural, a little too long. It lacked the gentle, almost musical quality he was used to. He chalked it up to a young deer, maybe one in distress. His hunter's instinct kicked in. Where there's a doe in distress, a buck is often not far behind. He waited, listening. The call came again, this time from a different direction, slightly to his left. It was closer. Again, that same unnatural, gravelly tone. A prickle of unease ran down his spine, but he pushed it away. This was his territory. He knew what was out here. He decided to leave his stand and track the sound. He moved slowly, his boots barely making a sound on the frozen leaves. The bleat sounded off again, closer still, just over a small ridge. Dale crept to the top of the ridge and peered over, expecting to see a doe. The clearing below was empty. But what he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. There was a set of fresh deer tracks in the thin layer of snow. They walked in a straight line, then, they just stopped. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no tracks of a wolf or a bear leading away. The deer tracks simply ceased to exist, as if the animal had been plucked straight up into the sky. A cold dread began to seep into Dale's bones. This was wrong. This was fundamentally, deeply wrong. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, not even the wind. It was a dead, suffocating silence. And then he heard the bleat again. It was right behind him. It was so close he could feel the vibration in the air. He whipped around, his rifle raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. There was nothing there. Just the dense, dark wall of pine trees. He stood frozen, scanning the tree-line, his eyes darting back and forth. He was being played with. The thought came to him, clear as a bell. Whatever was making that sound was intelligent. It was toying with him. It had led him away from his stand, into this strange, silent part of the forest. He didn't wait to find out what it was. He turned and ran. He didn't run like a man trying to be quiet. He ran like prey. Branches whipped at his face, and his lungs burned in the cold air, but he didn't stop. He didn't look back. The entire time, he felt a pair of unseen eyes boring into his back. He could feel its amusement, its predatory patience. He finally burst out of the woods onto the dirt road where his truck was parked. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so violently it took him 3 tries to get the door open. He threw his rifle in, jumped inside, and slammed the locks. He peeled out of there, spraying gravel, not once looking in his rearview mirror. Dale didn't hunt for the rest of the season. He tried to put the incident out of his mind, telling himself it was just a coyote or some other predator with a strange call, that his mind had played tricks on him. About a month later, he was home, in his quiet suburban neighborhood hundreds of miles away from that forest. It was late at night, and he was taking the trash out to the curb. His property backed up onto a small, manicured patch of woods, nothing more than a few dozen trees. As he stood at the end of his driveway, a sound drifted from those trees. A soft, guttural, unnaturally long bleat. Dale dropped the trash can. The contents spilled all over the asphalt. He stared into the darkness of those familiar, safe woods behind his house, and knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, that he hadn't escaped it at all. It had followed him home. Story 2. The Audience. Our next account comes from a bow hunter named Ethan. Bow hunting, more than any other form of hunting, requires an almost zen-like state of patience and stillness. You become a part of the landscape, a silent observer waiting for the perfect moment. Ethan had mastered this. He could sit in his tree stand for 8 hours straight, motionless, just watching the forest breathe around him. It was during one of these long, silent vigils in the hills of West Virginia that he realized he wasn't just an observer. He was also being observed. He was perched about 20 feet up a large oak, overlooking a game trail. The pre-dawn light was just beginning to filter through the canopy, painting the world in shades of gray. As the sun rose, the forest came alive. Squirrels chased each other, birds sang their morning chorus, and a feeling of peace settled over Ethan. Around mid-morning, however, a subtle shift occurred. It started as a faint, nagging feeling in the back of his mind, the kind of primal instinct that tells you you're being watched. He slowly scanned the woods around him. He saw nothing. A deer, a coyote, even another hunter, they all had a presence he could usually feel. This was different. It was a cold, empty, analytical stare. He tried to shake it off as paranoia. The woods can play tricks on your mind when you're alone for so long. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger, more focused. It felt less like he was in a forest and more like he was on a stage, under a spotlight. He felt utterly exposed. He decided to use his binoculars to do a more thorough scan. He moved with painstaking slowness, not wanting to betray his position, though he felt like whatever was watching already knew exactly where he was. He scanned from left to right, methodically, examining every tree, every bush, every shadow. And then he saw it. It was so well camouflaged he'd looked past it 3 times. Standing at the edge of a thicket, about 80 yards away, was a figure. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and unnaturally thin, like a branch that had been stretched out. Its color was the mottled gray and brown of dead bark, making it blend almost perfectly with the trees around it. It had long, stick-like limbs and a small, pale oval for a head that was tilted slightly, as if in curiosity. It had no discernible features. No eyes, no mouth. But Ethan knew, with absolute certainty, that it was looking right at him. The creature was perfectly still. Not the stillness of a predator waiting to pounce, but the absolute, unmoving stillness of a statue. It wasn't breathing. It wasn't shifting its weight. It was just there, watching. The peaceful forest now felt like a cage. The bird songs sounded like alarms. Every normal sound was amplified, distorted by his rising panic. He stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, locked in a silent staring contest. The thing never moved. Not an inch. Finally, the fear became too much to bear. He decided he had to leave. His hunt was over. Moving with a deliberate, quiet panic, he began to pack his gear into his small backpack. He kept his eyes locked on the figure, which remained motionless. He slung his bow over his shoulder and began the careful descent down the ladder attached to the tree. His perspective of the forest changed with every step down. And that's when the true horror of his situation was revealed. As he got lower, he could see past the trees that had blocked his view from the stand. And he saw another one. Another tall, thin, bark-colored figure, standing silently behind a fallen log. His eyes darted around the forest floor. There was another one by a cluster of ferns. And another, partially obscured by a thick maple tree. They weren't hiding. They were just standing there. They had been there the whole time. The entire woods, in every direction, was populated by these silent, motionless figures. He hadn't stumbled upon one strange creature. He had stumbled into the middle of an audience. An audience that had been watching his every move for hours, from every conceivable angle. He was on the last rung of the ladder, his feet just inches from the ground. He could feel dozens of empty, featureless faces all turned towards him. The forest was completely silent once more. They were all waiting for him to step off the ladder and join them on the forest floor. Story 3. The Collector. Some hunters are driven by the need for food, others by the peace of the outdoors. Garrett was driven by ambition. He was a trophy hunter, always seeking a bigger, more impressive rack for his collection. He was hunting elk in the rugged backcountry of Montana when he began tracking what he believed would be the trophy of a lifetime. He found the tracks early one morning. They were huge, larger than any elk prints he'd ever seen, pressed deep into the mud. The stride was long and powerful. This was a massive, mature bull. Excitement coursed through him. This was it. He began to follow the trail. 4 hours, the tracks led him deeper into the wilderness, away from his camp and into a region he didn't recognize from his maps. It was strange. The trail was almost too easy to follow, as if the elk wasn't trying to evade him at all. It was leading him somewhere. The tracks eventually led to the mouth of a narrow canyon he'd never seen before. A foul, coppery smell, like an old slaughterhouse, drifted out from between the rock walls. His gut told him to turn back. This felt wrong. But the thought of that record-breaking rack was too strong. He pushed his apprehension aside and pressed on. The canyon opened into a small, hidden valley, and at the far end was the dark mouth of a cave. The elk tracks led directly inside. Garrett hesitated. Bringing down an animal was one thing, but following it into a dark cave was foolish. Still, he'd come this far. He clicked on the flashlight attached to his rifle and cautiously stepped into the darkness. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a large, deep cavern. The foul smell was almost overpowering in here. As his eyes adjusted, he saw that the walls of the cave were lined with things. His blood ran cold. They were trophies, but not of animals. On one wall, a dozen different hunting rifles were mounted, just like he would mount a deer head. On another, there was a collection of backpacks, torn and weathered, hanging from hooks. A pile of worn-out hiking boots lay in a corner, neatly arranged by size. It was a gruesome gallery of human belongings. The elk hadn't been his prey. It had been a lure. Panic seized him. He spun around to flee, to get out of that horrific place. But the entrance of the cave was no longer empty. Silhouetted against the bright daylight was a figure. It was enormous, standing at least 9 feet tall, with a hulking, powerful frame covered in matted, dark fur. It stood on 2 legs, and in its massive, clawed hands, it was holding something. It was a brand-new hunting rifle, the metal glinting in the light. Garrett's flashlight beam danced across it, and his heart stopped. He recognized the custom stock, the high-end scope. It was the exact same model as the rifle he was holding in his own trembling hands. The creature had just returned from leading another hunter into its trap. And as it took a heavy, deliberate step into the darkness of the cave towards him, Garrett realized that his own rifle would soon be joining the collection on the wall. Story 4. The Cabin That Breathes. This story is about 2 friends, Mark and Tom, who went on their annual duck hunting trip in the marshlands of Louisiana. It was a tradition they'd had for years. But one year, a sudden violent storm turned their trip from a relaxing getaway into a desperate fight for survival. They were in a small boat, miles from their launch point, when the sky turned a sickening shade of green. The wind picked up in an instant, churning the calm water into a violent chop. Rain began to fall in blinding sheets. They were in serious trouble. Through the deluge, Tom spotted a small island, and on it, the dark shape of a building. A cabin. It was their only chance. They managed to beach their boat and scramble through the mud and lashing rain to the structure. It was an old, dilapidated trapper's cabin, but it had 4 walls and a roof. The door was unlocked. They stumbled inside, soaked and shivering, into a single dusty room. There was a stone fireplace, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner. It was abandoned, clearly, but it was shelter. As Mark worked on getting a fire started with the damp wood they found, Tom looked around the cabin. On the table, he found an old, leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. It seemed to be the diary of whoever had lived here last. "Listen to this," Tom said, his voice quiet. He began to read aloud. The journal entries described the author's growing isolation. But as the entries went on, they became more and more paranoid. He wrote about the strange noises the cabin made at night. He claimed the floorboards would creak and groan as if someone were walking on them, even when he was lying perfectly still. He wrote that he felt the walls were watching him. The last few entries were frantic, filled with terror. He wrote, "The cabin doesn't want me to leave. It feels hungry." A shiver went down Mark's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The storm outside raged, and the fire in the hearth cast long, dancing shadows around the room. Every creak of the old wood sounded menacing now. They spent a tense few hours in the cabin, waiting out the storm. Eventually, the wind died down, and the rain softened to a drizzle. It was time to go. Mark went to the door and pulled on the handle. It wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," he grunted, pulling with all his weight. Tom came over to help. Together, they heaved against the door, but it was as if it were welded shut. It was solid. They were trapped. A low, deep groaning sound echoed through the room, but it was not from the wind. It seemed to come from the floor beneath their feet. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like a deep, sleeping breath. The entire cabin seemed to vibrate with it, in and out. Tom, his face pale in the dying firelight, picked up the journal again. He flipped to the very last page. There was a single entry, written in a different, much neater handwriting than the rest. His voice trembled as he read it aloud. "The storm was terrible, but we were so glad to find this shelter. Now that it has passed, it's time to head home." Mark stared at him, confused. "What does that mean?" Tom's eyes were wide with dawning horror as he pointed to the bottom of the page. At the date written beneath the entry. It was today's date. They didn't find the journal. The cabin had just added their story to its pages. And as the floorboards beneath them groaned again, in a long, slow, hungry exhalation, they realized the previous owner was right. The cabin wouldn't let them leave. Story 5. Wrong Channel. Our final story tonight comes from two brothers, Ben and Sam, who were hunting moose in a vast, remote territory in northern Ontario. This was a place with no roads, no towns, and absolutely no cell service. Their only connection to each other and the outside world was a pair of powerful, long-range walkie-talkies. They set up a base camp and agreed to hunt in a large pincer movement, planning to meet up at a landmark known as Split Rock at sundown. For the first few hours, they checked in with each other periodically. "Anything on your end?" "Negative." "You?" The calls were clear. The plan was working. Around noon, Ben was tracking a set of prints when his radio crackled to life. It was Sam's voice, but it sounded strange. Faint, and with a weird, tinny echo. "Ben, you there?" "I need help," the voice said. "Twisted my ankle pretty bad." "Over." Ben's heart leaped into his throat. "Sam, I read you. What's your position?" "Over." The echoing voice gave him a set of directions, telling him to head west, towards a swampy area. It was the complete opposite direction of their rendezvous point at Split Rock. Ben didn't question it. His brother was hurt. He changed course immediately, crashing through the thick brush, calling out reassurances to Sam over the radio. The voice on the other end grew stranger. It would answer his questions, but then it would say unsettling things in a flat monotone. "It's easy to get lost out here, Ben. No one can hear you scream." "Over." Ben tried to dismiss it. "Sam, knock it off, this isn't funny," he'd say. But the voice would just reply, "Hurry, Ben. It's getting dark." He pushed on for over an hour, deep into unfamiliar territory. The landscape was becoming a treacherous bog. He was starting to panic. The directions weren't making sense. Then, his radio crackled with a different transmission. It was loud, clear, and frantic. It was Sam's real voice. Ben, can you hear me?" "Oh, thank God." "Don't listen to it, Ben. Turn your radio off." "That's not me. I'm at Split Rock." "It's not me." "Over." The blood in Ben's veins turned to ice. He stopped dead in his tracks, standing in the middle of a swampy, desolate clearing. He had been talking to something else. Something had been using his brother's voice to lure him out here alone. He had walked right into a trap. His hand, shaking uncontrollably, reached for the volume dial on his walkie-talkie to shut it off. But before he could, the mimic's voice came through one last time. The echo and the static were gone. It was a perfectly clear, calm whisper, so close it sounded like it was standing right next to his ear. It didn't say, "Over." It just said, with chilling precision, Ben's full name and his home address, 1,000 miles away. He slammed the radio off and ran. He was hopelessly lost, but he didn't care. He just knew he had to get away from the thing that not only knew his name, but now knew exactly where he lived. The wilderness keeps its secrets well. These hunters went in seeking a challenge, and they found one, not from the animals they were hunting, but from the deep and ancient darkness that watches from between the trees. It leaves you to wonder what else is out there, listening on the wind, and waiting for you to take one step too far from the trail. Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories.